I woke up Tuesday morning to find Susan Pritchard standing at the edge of my yard with a clipboard, photographing my stone border like she was documenting evidence at a crime scene. The early autumn sun barely crested over the mountains of eastern Montana, casting long shadows across my property in Billings. And there she stood in her crisp khaki pants and pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. "Morning, Susan," I called out, walking toward her with my coffee mug still steaming in the cool morning air. My name is Ethan Jennings, and I had lived in this house for 3 years now, ever since my divorce left me needing a fresh start somewhere quieter than Seattle. She looked up from her phone, not bothering to hide what she was doing. "Good morning, Ethan. I'm here conducting a routine property inspection. Your stone border violates Section 12.4 of the HOA guidelines. Natural stone borders exceeding 4 inches in height require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the caffeine do nothing to calm the irritation already building in my chest. "Susan, those stones have been there since before this neighborhood existed. They mark the original property survey from 1870. Her face remained expressionless, that practiced look of bureaucratic indifference I had come to associate with her during my time in Sunrise Meadows. The irony of that name was not lost on me. There were no meadows here anymore, just cookie-cutter houses on quarter-acre lots, with my property being the exception at nearly 2 acres, the remnant of an old homestead that had been subdivided decades ago. "That may be," she said, tapping something on her tablet, "but the guidelines clearly state that any visible borders or fencing must conform to current HOA standards. You have 14 days to remove them or face fines starting at $200 per day. You cannot be serious." "I'm always serious about maintaining property values, Ethan. The rules exist for everyone's benefit." She turned and walked back toward her white Lexus SUV parked in front of my house, leaving me standing there in my bathrobe holding my coffee like an idiot. I spent the rest of that morning at my kitchen table, pulling out the property documents I had received when I purchased the house. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Fletcher, had mentioned the stones during our walkthrough, telling me they were part of the original survey markers placed by territorial surveyors in 1870. Back then, Montana was still a territory, 5 years before statehood, and the land was being carved up and sold to homesteaders willing to brave the harsh winters and endless prairie. The stones themselves were distinctive, large granite rocks spaced roughly 20 feet apart, running along the eastern and southern boundaries of my property. Each one was about the size of a milk crate, with old chisel marks still visible on some. Dorothy had said her grandfather pointed them out to her when she was a child, explaining their significance. They were not decorative. They were historical markers. I called my lawyer, Marcus Green, a guy I had known since college who now practiced property law in Billings. We had reconnected when I moved to town, and he handled my house purchase. "Marcus, I need your help with something ridiculous." "HOA, how did you know?" "Because 90% of my property calls these days are HOA disputes. What did they do now?" I explained the situation with the stones, the survey markers, and Susan's threat of fines. Marcus listened without interrupting, which I appreciated about him. He was a good listener, a trait that probably made him excellent at his job. "Do you have documentation proving those stones are original survey markers?" he asked. "I have the property deed, which references the original survey. Dorothy Fletcher, the previous owner, told me about them, but I do not know if she ever documented it officially." "Find out. Get a statement from her if you can. In the meantime, I will pull the original survey records from the county. If those stones are indeed part of an 1870 survey, they might qualify for historical preservation protection. That would supersede any HOA covenant. How long will that take? Give me a week. Do not let them touch those stones. If they send contractors, document everything. I thanked him and hung up, then searched through my paperwork for Dorothy's contact information. She had moved to a retirement community in Bozeman to be closer to her daughter. I found her number and dialed, hoping she still had the same phone. "Hello." Her voice was exactly as I remembered, warm and slightly gravelly from decades of Montana wind. "Mrs. Fletcher, this is Ethan Jennings. I bought your house on Prairie View Road 3 years ago." "Oh, Ethan. How wonderful to hear from you. How is the house treating you?" "The house is great. I am calling about the stone border, the survey markers you showed me. Do you remember telling me about them?" "Of course I remember. Those stones have been there my entire life. My grandfather used to tell me stories about watching the surveyors place them when he was a boy. Is something wrong?" I explained the situation with the HOA. Dorothy's warm tone turned sharp. "That is absolutely ridiculous. Those stones are part of Montana history. My family has protected them for over 150 years, and I specifically chose you as a buyer because you seemed like someone who would respect their significance." "I do respect them, Mrs. Fletcher. That is why I am fighting this. Would you be willing to provide a written statement about the stones and their history?" "I will do better than that. I have photographs, old family documents, and my grandfather's journal where he mentions the original survey. Give me your email address, and I will have my daughter help me scan everything and send it to you." Relief washed over me. "That would be incredible. Thank you. Those stones stay exactly where they are, Ethan. You tell that busybody HOA president that Dorothy Fletcher said they can take their covenants and shove them where the Montana sun does not shine." I laughed for the first time that day. We said our goodbyes, and I gave her my email address. Within hours, my inbox contained a treasure trove of historical documents. Photographs from the early 1900s showing the stones already weathered and moss-covered. Pages from her grandfather's journal describing the territorial surveyors, their equipment, and the process of marking property boundaries. Letters between early homesteaders referencing the stone markers as meeting points and boundary indicators. I forwarded everything to Marcus, feeling like I actually had ammunition for this fight now. But I knew Susan would not back down easily. She had made a career out of enforcing HOA rules in Sunrise Meadows, taking pride in maintaining what she called neighborhood standards. In reality, she enjoyed the power trip of telling people what they could and could not do with their own property. The next day, I received the official violation notice in my mailbox. It was printed on HOA letterhead, detailed and officious, citing multiple sections of the covenants and giving me exactly 14 days to comply or face escalating fines. The letter was signed by Susan and 2 other board members I barely knew, Richard Chen and Patricia Morrison. I scanned the document and sent it to Marcus, then posted about the situation on my social media. I was not normally one for airing grievances online, but I figured community support might help. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors I barely knew commented with their own HOA horror stories. A local news reporter named Jennifer Hale reached out, asking if she could cover the story for the Billings Gazette. "Historical survey markers being threatened by an HOA," she said when I called her back. "That is exactly the kind of local interest story we love. Would you be willing to do an interview?" "Absolutely." We scheduled it for Friday afternoon. Jennifer arrived with a photographer, a young guy named Tim who immediately understood the significance of the stones when I showed them to him. "These are incredible," Tim said, crouching beside one of the larger markers. "You can see the chisel marks. They probably used hand tools to shape these." Jennifer interviewed me for 45 minutes, asking detailed questions about the stones, the HOA's position, and my plans to fight the violation. I showed her Dorothy's documents, the photographs, the journal entries. She took notes constantly, her expression shifting from professional interest to genuine outrage as I explained Susan's threats. "This is going to make a great story," she said as they packed up their equipment. "We will run it Sunday, front page of the local section." Sunday morning, I bought 5 copies of the Billings Gazette. The article was exactly where Jennifer promised, with a large photograph of me standing beside one of the stone markers. The headline read, "HOA threatens historic survey markers in Sunrise Meadows." The article was balanced and well-researched, including quotes from a Montana State University historian, who confirmed that territorial survey markers were rare and valuable historical artifacts. Susan called me at 8 in the morning, her voice tight with fury. "You went to the press. How dare you try to embarrass the HOA board publicly?" "I am not trying to embarrass anyone, Susan. I am trying to protect historically significant property markers that have been here for over 150 years. Those rocks are an eyesore and violate multiple sections of our covenants. The bad publicity does not change that. Actually, it might. I have a lawyer working on historical preservation protections. If those stones qualify, your covenants do not matter. We will see about that." She hung up. My phone rang constantly for the rest of the day. Neighbors called to express support. Strangers from other parts of Billings contacted me through social media. A local historical society reached out, offering to help document the stones properly. Even a state senator's office called, saying they were monitoring the situation. Marcus called Monday morning with good news. "I pulled the original survey from 1870. Those stones are definitely the markers. More importantly, I filed an emergency petition with the county to designate them as protected historical landmarks. If approved, the HOA cannot touch them." "How long until we know?" "The County Historical Preservation Board meets Thursday. I got us on the agenda. You will need to present evidence and answer questions, but with what Dorothy sent you and the newspaper article, I think we have a solid case." Thursday afternoon, I walked into the Yellowstone County Administrative Building with Marcus, carrying a folder full of documents and feeling nervous despite our preparation. The Historical Preservation Board consisted of 5 members, a mix of county officials and local historians. They sat behind a long table, reviewing papers as Marcus and I took our seats in the small hearing room. Susan was there too, sitting on the opposite side with her own folder and a lawyer I did not recognize. A severe-looking woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Gail Thornton. The board chair, an older gentleman named Robert Walsh, called the meeting to order and asked Marcus to present our case. My lawyer stood and laid out the evidence methodically. The original survey documents, Dorothy's family records, the journal entries, photographs showing the stones unchanged for over a century. He cited Montana state law regarding historical preservation and argued that the markers met all criteria for protection. Gail Thornton presented the HOA's counter-argument, claiming the stones were simply old rocks with no definitive proof of their origin, and that property covenants took precedence over historical claims. She argued that allowing these exceptions would undermine the HOA's authority to maintain neighborhood standards. If Mr. Jennings can ignore landscaping guidelines, What stops other homeowners from similar violations? She said. The covenants exist to protect everyone's property values. The board members asked questions for over an hour. They examined the photographs, read excerpts from the journal, and debated the validity of various documents. Finally, Robert Walsh called for a vote. All in favor of granting historical landmark status to the survey markers on the Jennings property. 4 hands went up immediately. Only one board member abstained, citing insufficient expertise to judge the evidence. The motion passes. The stone markers on the property located at 1742 Prairie View Road are hereby designated as protected historical landmarks under county jurisdiction. No alteration or removal is permitted without county approval. Relief hit me like a physical force. Marcus shook my hand, grinning. Across the room, Susan's face had gone red. She gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements while Gail Thornton whispered something to her. Outside the building, Susan confronted me in the parking lot. "This is not over, Ethan. You may have won this battle, but there are other covenant violations on your property. I will find them." "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise. The rules apply to everyone." She left before I could respond. Marcus had heard everything. "Document that conversation," he said. "If she starts targeting you for retaliation, we can go after the HOA board for harassment." The next 2 weeks were quiet. Too quiet. I kept waiting for Susan to follow through on her threat, but nothing came. The newspaper ran a follow-up article about the Preservation Board's decision, and I received congratulations from neighbors and strangers. The Historical Society scheduled a visit to properly document the stones and place informational markers explaining their significance. Then the new violation notices started arriving. My mailbox was empty one Friday afternoon, and the grass on my south lawn exceeded the maximum allowed height of 3 inches. Violation. My garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. Violation. A small oil stain in my driveway violated Section 8.7 regarding surface maintenance. Violation. Every notice came with threatened fines. Every citation was technically accurate, even if absurdly petty. Susan was making good on her promise. I photographed everything and sent it to Marcus. "She is harassing me. This is retaliation." I agree, but proving it legally is tricky. She is not violating any laws by enforcing covenants, even if her motivations are questionable. "Document everything, pay the fines for now, and we will build a harassment case if it continues." The fines were not substantial individually, but they added up. $50 here, $75 there. By the end of October, I had paid nearly $800 in various violations, many of which I had not even known existed. Meanwhile, I noticed that other neighbors with similar issues received no citations. My neighbor Jeff had grass twice as tall as mine, no violation notice. Patricia Morrison, one of the board members, had garbage cans permanently visible from her driveway, no citation. I started documenting these discrepancies, photographing other properties with the same alleged violations I was being fined for. The pattern was clear. Susan was targeting me specifically while ignoring identical issues elsewhere in the neighborhood. Jennifer Hale called me in early November. "I have been getting tips from other homeowners in Sunrise Meadows. They are saying Susan Pritchard has a history of selective enforcement and targeting people who challenge her authority. Would you be interested in a follow-up article?" "Definitely." The second article ran 2 weeks later, this time featuring interviews with multiple homeowners who had been targeted by Susan after disagreeing with the board. A couple who fought a fence height regulation found themselves cited for violations they never knew existed. A single mother who questioned assessment increases suddenly faced fines for holiday decorations. The pattern was undeniable. Susan sent me a cease and desist letter through Gail Thornton, demanding I stop making defamatory statements to the press. Marcus laughed when I showed him the letter. This is not defamation if it is true. In fact, this letter helps our harassment case. She is trying to silence criticism, which demonstrates a pattern of retaliation. Things escalated the first week of December. I came home from work one evening to find construction equipment parked at the edge of my property. A small excavator and a crew of 3 men were measuring distances along my eastern boundary, near where several of the protected stone markers sat. I got out of my truck and approached them. "What are you doing?" The crew supervisor, a weathered man in his 50s with a thick beard, looked up from his measuring tape. "HOA hired us to install a drainage system along this property line. We start digging tomorrow. You cannot dig here. Those stones are protected historical landmarks." He frowned and pulled out a work order on his phone. "Says here we are approved to excavate along the eastern boundary of this property. Nothing about landmarks. Who hired you?" "Sunrise Meadows HOA. Lady named Susan Pritchard." I called Marcus immediately. "Susan hired contractors to dig along the stone markers. They claim it is for a drainage system. Do not let them start work. I will file for an emergency injunction tonight. If they damage those stones, the HOA could face serious legal consequences." I turned back to the supervisor. "I need you to hold off on this project. Those stones have legal protection, and the HOA did not disclose that to you." He looked skeptical. "I cannot just stop work without authorization from whoever hired us." "Then call Susan Pritchard and tell her you are waiting until this gets resolved. If you damage those stones, you could be held liable." That got his attention. Liability was a magic word for contractors. He made a call, spoke to someone, then hung up looking annoyed. "We will hold for 24 hours while this gets sorted out. But if we do not hear otherwise, we are proceeding." Marcus filed the emergency injunction that night. The judge granted a temporary restraining order preventing any excavation near the protected stones until a hearing could be scheduled. The hearing was set for the following Monday. Susan called me Saturday morning, and her voice was shaking with rage. "You are costing the HOA thousands of dollars in contractor delays. That drainage system is necessary for proper water management throughout the neighborhood. Then, why did you not disclose the protected markers to the contractors? Why did you schedule work that could damage historically significant landmarks? Those rocks are not that significant. They are just old boundary markers. You have blown this completely out of proportion. The County Preservation Board disagrees with you." The County Preservation Board is a group of busybodies who have nothing better to do than interfere with property rights. Do you know how much this is costing us? Do you care that your selfishness is raising fees for everyone in this neighborhood? Susan, you created this situation by trying to remove the stones in the first place. All you had to do was leave them alone. She hung up on me. Monday's hearing was contentious. The judge, a woman named Kathleen Brenner, reviewed the evidence and questioned both sides sharply. Gail Thornton argued that the drainage system was essential infrastructure and that the HOA had not intended to damage the markers. "We planned to work around them," she claimed. Marcus presented the work order, which showed excavation planned within 5 feet of multiple stones, with no mention of protection or special handling. He also presented emails he had subpoenaed showing Susan had been aware of the landmark designation when she hired the contractors. Judge Brenner was not impressed. "Mrs. Pritchard, did you inform the contractors about the protected status of these stones?" Susan, under oath now, hesitated. I did not think it was necessary. The work was not supposed to affect them. The work order clearly shows excavation in immediate proximity to the markers. Your failure to disclose their protected status could have resulted in irreparable damage to historical landmarks. I am making the restraining order permanent. No excavation work may proceed on or near those markers without explicit approval from both the County Preservation Board and Mr. Jennings. Gail Thornton tried to argue, but the judge cut her off. This hearing is concluded. The HOA will also be responsible for Mr. Jennings's legal fees related to this matter. Outside the courthouse, Susan confronted me again. This time, she was beyond anger. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "You are destroying this HOA. You understand that? Years of work maintaining property values, creating a desirable neighborhood, all being undermined because you cannot follow simple rules. I am not the one who tried to destroy historical landmarks, Susan. I am not the one who hired contractors without proper disclosure. You did this. I should have never let you buy in this neighborhood. Dorothy Fletcher sold to you out of spite, knowing you would be trouble. Dorothy sold to me because she trusted me to protect those stones, something she clearly could not trust you to do." A few other HOA board members had gathered watching our confrontation. Richard Chen, one of the members who had signed my original violation notice, stepped forward. "Susan, maybe we should reconsider our approach here. This is getting out of hand." She turned on him. "Out of hand? We have rules for a reason, Richard. If we do not enforce them, we have nothing. But are we enforcing them fairly?" Patricia Morrison spoke up, surprising me. She had been silent through most of this conflict. "I have been reviewing the violation notices from the past 6 months. Ethan has received more citations than the rest of the neighborhood combined. That does not seem right. He has more violations than anyone else." "Does he?" "Because I counted 15 properties with grass exceeding 3 inches this summer. Ethan was the only one cited. I counted 8 properties with visible garbage cans. Again, only Ethan cited. This looks like targeted enforcement to me." Susan's face flushed. "This is not the time or place for this discussion." "Actually, I think it is," Richard said. "We need to schedule a special board meeting to review enforcement policies." They left arguing among themselves. Marcus patted my shoulder. "This is good. Internal dissent on the board weakens Susan's position. If the other members turn against her, she will not have the votes to keep targeting you." The special board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the neighborhood clubhouse. It was open to all homeowners, and the room was packed when I arrived. Word had spread about the conflict, and people were curious to see how it would play out. Susan called the meeting to order, looking composed despite the tension. The agenda was listed as Review of Enforcement Policies and Procedures, but everyone knew what it was really about. Richard Chen presented statistics he had compiled showing enforcement patterns over the past year. The numbers were damning. My property had received 37 violation notices. The rest of the 200 homes in Sunrise Meadows had received 41 combined. The disparity was impossible to explain as anything other than targeted harassment. Homeowners started speaking up, sharing their own experiences with selective enforcement. A man named Doug Peterson described being cited for a minor paint touch-up issue after he questioned a fee increase. A woman named Sarah Kim talked about facing multiple violations after requesting financial transparency from the board. Susan tried to defend the enforcement pattern, claiming that some properties simply had more issues than others. But her arguments sounded hollow, even to her supporters. Then something unexpected happened. Jeff Morrison, Patricia's husband, stood up holding a thick folder. "I need to disclose something," he said, and Patricia's face went pale. My wife has been complicit in Susan's harassment campaign, and I cannot stay silent anymore. This folder contains emails and text messages showing Susan and Patricia deliberately targeting specific homeowners for retaliation. The room went silent. Jeff approached the board table and handed the folder to Richard Chen, who began reading with increasing alarm. "These emails discuss fabricating violations," Richard said slowly. "They talk about hiring inspectors to find problems with specific properties. There are messages about coordinating violation notices to maximize fines and stress." Patricia Morrison stood up, her chair scraping loudly. "Jeff, what are you doing?" "What I should have done months ago. This has to stop." Susan's composure finally cracked. "Those are private communications. You had no right to take them." "They are evidence of corruption and harassment," Jeff said. "I am a homeowner here too, and I will not let this board destroy people's lives because they dare to disagree." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Homeowners were shouting questions. Susan was demanding order. Patricia left the room crying. Richard Chen called for an immediate vote to suspend Susan and Patricia from the board pending an investigation. The vote was unanimous among the remaining 3 board members. Susan refused to leave, screaming about improper procedure and calling for the homeowners to support her. But the mood in the room had shifted completely. People who had once trusted her to maintain the neighborhood now saw her as a petty tyrant who had abused her power. Security had to escort her from the clubhouse, still shouting about covenants and property values as she was led to her car. In the aftermath, the HOA hired an outside management company to review all enforcement actions from the past 3 years. They found systematic patterns of retaliation, selective enforcement, and financial irregularities. Susan had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as administrative costs. Patricia had been complicit in some of the harassment, but primarily guilty of enabling Susan's behavior. Both women were removed from the board permanently and banned from serving in HOA leadership positions. The board voted to refund all fines that had been improperly assessed, which meant I received a check for $800 plus interest. Criminal charges came next. The county prosecutor reviewed the evidence of financial fraud and decided Susan's misuse of HOA funds constituted theft by embezzlement. She had taken over $12,000 over 2 years, using HOA credit cards for personal shopping, travel, and dining expenses. The police arrested her on a Thursday morning in January. I watched from my window as 2 officers walked her to their patrol car in handcuffs. There was no satisfaction in seeing her arrested, only a weary relief that it was finally over. Her trial was quick. The evidence was overwhelming, and her lawyer negotiated a plea deal. Susan Pritchard pleaded guilty to embezzlement and was sentenced to 18 months in county jail with 3 years probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and could never serve in any HOA leadership position in Montana again. Patricia Morrison avoided criminal charges but faced civil lawsuits from several homeowners, including me. We settled out of court, with her agreeing to pay damages and issue a formal apology. The new HOA board, elected in emergency voting after the scandal broke, took a radically different approach to enforcement. They revised the covenants to be less restrictive, eliminated petty violations, and implemented transparent oversight procedures. Richard Chen became the new president and did an excellent job rebuilding trust in the community. Dorothy Fletcher called me when she heard about everything that had happened. "I knew you were the right person for that house," she said. "My grandfather would have been proud. Those stones stayed exactly where they belonged, thanks to you and your family records. Without that documentation, I never could have fought this. History matters, Ethan. It is not just dates and old documents. It is about respecting the people who came before us and the work they did to build something lasting. You understood that. The County Historical Society installed permanent markers near the stones the following spring, with plaques explaining their significance and history. They organized a small ceremony for the installation, which Dorothy attended despite the long drive from Bozeman. Local news covered it, and even some state media picked up the story as a positive example of historic preservation. I gave a short speech at the ceremony, talking about the importance of protecting history even when it is inconvenient, even when bureaucrats and busybodies want to erase it in the name of uniformity and control. The stones had survived harsh Montana winters, territorial disputes, and over a century of change. They would continue to survive, marking boundaries and bearing witness to everything that came after them. Jennifer Hale wrote a final article about the resolution of the conflict, framing it as a victory for both historical preservation and homeowner rights against overreaching HOA boards. The article sparked conversations across Montana and beyond about HOA reform and the balance between community standards and individual property rights. My life returned to normal slowly. The constant stress of watching for violation notices disappeared. I could work in my yard without worrying that Susan was photographing everything. My neighbors became friendly again, no longer worried about being associated with the troublemaker who challenged the board. Marcus and I stayed friends, though thankfully I had no further need for his legal services. He told me the case had become something of a legend in local property law circles, a perfect example of historical preservation law superseding private covenants. "You should write a book about this," he joked over beers one evening. "Nobody would believe it," I said. The whole thing was too ridiculous. That is what makes it perfect. Truth is stranger than fiction. I sold the house 5 years later when my company transferred me to Denver. The new owners were a young couple, teachers who loved the property's history and promised to protect the stones. I gave them all of Dorothy's documents and explained everything that had happened, wanting them to understand what they were inheriting. "These stones are more than property markers," I told them. "They are a connection to the people who settled this land, who survived out here when Montana was still wild and uncertain. The HOA tried to erase them because they did not fit some arbitrary standard of neighborhood aesthetics. Do not ever let anyone convince you that conformity matters more than history." They understood. Before I left, we walked the property line together, and I showed them each stone, pointing out the old chisel marks, explaining which surveyor probably placed each one based on Dorothy's grandfather's journal. Dorothy herself had passed away the previous winter at 93. Her daughter sent me a letter saying Dorothy had been proud of what I did, that she spoke about it often in her final years. That meant more to me than any legal victory or newspaper article. On my last day in Montana, I drove out to the cemetery where Dorothy was buried and left flowers on her grave. "Thank you," I said to the cold marble stone. "Thank you for trusting me with your family's history." The wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow. Montana had been good to me, teaching me about standing firm for what mattered, about fighting battles worth fighting, and about the importance of preserving the past even when it was inconvenient. Those stones still mark the property boundary, solid and unmovable, exactly where they were placed in 1870. They will be there long after I am gone, long after everyone involved in this story is forgotten. That is the nature of stone and history. It endures while everything else fades away. Susan Pritchard served her sentence and moved away from Montana entirely. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she relocated to Florida, far from anyone who knew about her fall from power. I hope she learned something from the experience, though I had my doubts. People who crave control rarely change. Patricia Morrison still lived in Sunrise Meadows last I heard, keeping a low profile and avoiding any involvement in neighborhood politics. Some people forgave her, seeing her as someone who got caught up in Susan's crusade. Others never forgot her complicity. That was her burden to carry. Richard Chen did excellent work reforming the HOA, and property values in Sunrise Meadows actually increased once the oppressive enforcement culture disappeared. Turns out people wanted to live in communities where they could enjoy their homes without constant harassment. Who could have guessed? I think about those stones sometimes, especially when I am dealing with the HOA in my new Denver neighborhood. They are more reasonable here, less invasive, but I still feel that tension whenever I receive any communication from them. Once you have been through what I experienced, you never quite trust HOA boards again, but the stones taught me something valuable. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems absurd, even when everyone tells you to just comply and move on. History matters. Property rights matter. Standing up to petty tyrants matters. The surveyors who placed those rocks in 1870 did not know their work would still matter over 150 years later, but it does. Everything we do leaves marks that outlast us. We get to choose whether those marks are worth preserving or deserve to be forgotten. I chose preservation, and I would make the same choice again.